Cool.
Hey guys, it's Devin here with Make Anything, and so you may know I've started my Etsy shop. I'm gonna start shipping stuff out to you guys, selling cool 3D prints. So I've got all my packaging material here, envelopes and boxes and such. And you know, I'm starting out simple, just like recycled cardboard, just regular mailers, nothing crazy. But I still thought, you know, it'd be nice to brand my packaging somehow. So I decided to make a project out of it. And that's what I'm doing today. I'm gonna make a little stamp with the Make Anything logo. That way I could just stamp the packages and boom. Now you know, when you get that package, it's gonna be good. So let's go ahead and jump into SolidWorks and I'll show you guys what I'm working with. So I already made my first version of this stamp, so I'll just run through the steps. Basically, I started with a line drawing of my logo, but I beefed up all the outlines because I was worried about the stamp being too flimsy. So I give them a nice thick line, something like 1.6 millimeters wide. Also, to add strength, instead of just extruding straight up, I gave everything a 30-degree outward draft. And that creates a more of a wedge-like shape that should add strength to the stamp. Then I added a backing to hold everything together, and that is the rubber part of my stamp. Around that, I revolved a slightly larger puck with an inset to set that rubber into, and that I'm going to print in PLA so that I have a hard backing to press down on and get more even pressure on my stamp. I chamfered those edges so they're a little more friendly, and I also put the logo on this backing so that you can line up stamps more easily and see exactly where your stamp is going to go. I can color these separately so you can see this is the PLA part, and I'll also color just the faces that will be receiving ink. That way you can see what the stamp itself will look like. So even though there are some weird intersections at these corners, it doesn't really matter because those red faces are the only parts that are actually going to be stamped down. So I'll go ahead and export each of these pieces individually as STLs and then bring them into Simplify 3D. I'll quickly show you guys what I did with the rubber part of the stamp in Simplify 3D because it's a little bit different from what you would usually do when printing a part. So this is how you would orient the print if you didn't want to have any overhangs whatsoever. The bottom is completely flat, and so there would be no problems. But I'm actually going to flip it around and print it the other way. And that's so the part of the flexible filament that's actually going to be doing the stamping is flat on the build plate. And that's going to create a very clean bottom surface for me to stamp with, versus the top surface of the print, which is usually a little bit rough. As far as my print settings, I don't really need to change anything. I'm just going to slow down my print to 30 millimeters per second instead of my standard 80. And that's just because Ninja Flex comes out of the extruder pretty slow, and you know, you gotta print slower. So here I am printing out the stamp in clear Ninja Flex, and even at 30 millimeters per second, the print was coming out pretty stringy. So I had to scrap that one and do it again even slower. Here I'm going, I think, 15 millimeters per second. Super slow, but that's what it takes for a really clean print. And for a stamp, I want a really clean print. Here it is off the build plate, and I decided to give it a quick test without the backing. Even using this super old ink pad from the 90s, the stamp still came out really good. But I decided to go back into SolidWorks and make some changes just to try to make an even nicer stamp. Since the stamp was so successful, I decided I could try making those lines thinner so that it would match the original logo a little better. So I made those lines about half as thick as they were before. And I also reduced the height of the extrusion to 2 millimeters, since it didn't need to be as tall as it was before. And why not save material? I didn't really have to make any changes to the rest of the stamp, although I did make this rim a little smaller, just to save material again, and make it easier to line up the stamp. All minor changes, but I think the results will be a little bit better. It printed out nicely once again, And this time I also used a pair of clippers to kind of snip off those tiny little strings that are coming off the print. You can't really use an X-Acto knife or a regular pair of scissors with NinjaFlex just because it's so tough. So these tiny clippers work well, and you could probably use nail clippers as well. So here's my test of the second version of the stamp, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Making those lines just that much thinner makes it much more authentic to my original logo. I printed out my backing and glued everything into place using E6000 craft adhesive. With that stamp coming out so nicely, I decided to make another one using my personal logo. And to try something new and get a really clean print, I decided to print onto glass. I clipped this mirror onto my build plate, and I'm going to print directly onto that. This wouldn't work on an unheated build plate like mine with PLA or most plastics, but NinjaFlex really doesn't shrink or warp at all, so I figured it could work. Sure enough, the print worked out. In fact, it came out incredibly nicely. Look at this glossy finish. I also glued this rubber into a backing plate that I made for it, and I left everything overnight so that the glue could harden. The next day, when I got my stamps out and decided to put them to use, I found that they weren't working quite like they were the day before. For some reason, only the edges of my stamp were picking up ink. I think it might have to do with the glue having a chemical reaction with the plastic and kind of making it sag in the middle. As a quick fix, I used a thick cardstock and cut out a circle slightly smaller than my stamp, and then another one even smaller than that, and I glued those onto the inside of my backing. Then I put the rubber back on top. That way the inside parts of my stamp would be raised a little more than the edges. And that ended up doing the trick pretty well. I did the same thing for my other stamp, cutting out a tiny rectangle and putting that inside. And as you can see, that little modification really made the difference. Well, there you have it. A 3D printed stamp, and that's about as good as I expected it to get. Printing onto glass worked super well for this NinjaFlex. I didn't even have to heat the build plate or anything, and I got a really nice clean bottom layer for this stamp. So that's a really neat trick, especially useful for this purpose. And I also realized that I kind of want to dome the bottom of the stamp, that way the middle parts get ink as well as the outside. So I guess that makes it successful in more than one way. I got a great product out of it, and I learned a few things. I think that's the best you could ask for out of a project. Alright, that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you liked it. And let me know in the comments, if you were to make a 3D printed stamp, what would it be? Until next time, I'm Devin. This is Make Anything. Don't forget to stay inspired.